All right, great. So obviously this session is a last-minute replacement, and we basically put together what should you know about ATSC 3.0. So right now, in fact, in the room, who here knows what ATSC 3.0 is? Okay, good. So you guys are in place. And in fact, if you have more questions, we'll actually try to make this a little bit more interactive since we have an engaged audience. So Jason, is this an acronym or a game changer? I'm going to first get you, what is ATSC 3.0?
Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Jason Justman. I work in Sinclair Digital up in Seattle. We are part of the larger Sinclair organization and working in conjunction with One Media on the East Coast. We are looking as to how the next generation of broadcasting can be facilitated with ATSC 3.0. Okay. What that really means is, we've in Seattle been so focused on the digital experience when it comes to desktop, mobile web, mobile applications, OTT experiences. Those touch points are where a core of our business and audience is today. Sinclair is in 89 markets in the US. We have 120 distinct brands across the US. We produce 500 hours of live local content, and I'm sure as you've heard over the past couple days, there's more content in the mix. But at the end of the day, there's a big challenge out there in the marketplace, which is especially things like social media, like Facebook is massive when it comes to distributing video. Mm-hmm. 2 or 3 years ago, they didn't really have a presence at all in video, and now it's fundamentally changed. And so what we've been looking at is to how to then we advance the technology and the business to still be relevant to those audiences. So at the end of the day, ATSC 3.0 isn't just an incremental growth in traditional broadcasting. It's completely transformational because it relies on a different network design, but more importantly, a different policy and regulatory mechanism from the FCC, which allows for use cases of channel sharing and virtual broadcasting, which is really interesting.
Now, but you also, essentially, you can, under ATSC 3.0, video, audio, data.
So yes, all of those three things combined and additional use cases for alerting and some technical stuff about waking up devices. So inside of the signal, it's built for very low power receiving devices to be able to listen and wake up to a specific payload. What this means is it's not just data as we know it today, like IP data, but it could be other metadata specific to maybe just your device, or maybe to your automobile, or maybe to your refrigerator, right? So there's a lot of interesting use cases when this comes together, where we break down the traditional one-to-many broadcasting, which is what has been out in ATSC 1.0. You can't broadcast unless you're in the facility. ATSC 3.0 moves that into a data-first, IP-centric model, which fundamentally changes of how we distribute information.
Okay, so for a couple of the people in the audience who are not as familiar with this, as I might not be, my name, by the way, is Nadine Kravitz. I work as a contributing editor for Streaming Media Magazine, and I'm also a consultant in several areas that are related to what I write on. Now, first off, when I started to look into reading about ATSC 3.0, there's a lot of technical information out there, and for good reason. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned earlier that this is something that the content creators have yet to actually start to become aware of, and therefore don't. Mm-hmm. The awareness has been more on the technical side. So give us like a kind of set the stage for what can be used in terms of a technical point of view, and what can be used on the content side, and why does this matter?
Right, so fundamentally, one of the most interesting use cases for ATSC 3.0 is being able to open what was traditionally broadcast-only spectrum, right? In the past couple of years, with the repack initiatives and the forward and reverse auctions, we've seen an opening from the FCC to open up that spectrum to the highest bidder. Well, now what that's also available is to, inside of those individual spectrum blocks, is the ability to deliver content through there. So the long and the short of it means that with these technical innovations now, that 6 megahertz of spectrum we have in like Traverse City, Michigan, now can essentially be available to other broadcasters or other data delivery services and use cases. And where this comes into play in the ecosystem is really, we see potentially in the long term, is a convergence between traditional OTT and traditional OTA, where they come together.
Okay.
And fundamentally, this is smarter pipes. Whereas next generation technology like 5G may be bigger pipes, but if you're delivering 1 million copies of the stream, and it's the same stream to every one of your audiences, why are you delivering 1 million when you could deliver 1?
Okay. And I'm sure that's a question that many people in the room think about. Now, if you're delivering 1 stream, how are you personalizing?
So there is a interesting challenge that the ATSC 3.0 committee has in front of them, which is in the about 2,000 pages of specification. And these are
Which
all—
you're not going to go into,
No,
right?
I'm not going to go into, but I just
Okay.
wanted to give some context.
Excellent.
This is heavily based in the RF engineering side, the network topology and design, single frequency network, all these things that are so low level that I don't even want to know about them myself. But fundamentally, inside of that whole specification, there's maybe 4 to 5 sentences that deal with the use case of advertising.
Okay.
Now, I say advertising as in personalization because this is one of the biggest challenges in traditional 1.0 broadcasting, which is how do we solve the ad tech problem? So inside of ATSC 3.0, there's a lot of opportunity to build and develop interactive applications. And right now, that's set to interactive applications that can provide personalization and can provide monetization. But the framework is structured such that it's up to the broadcaster or distributor to facilitate that. Now, traditional broadcasters, they don't really build apps. They don't really build the experiences. They deliver the content to the
Right.
audiences. So there's an opportunity here, especially in the ecosystem of the OTT world and the streaming media world, to help provide those similar experiences, what would traditionally be a broadband-enabled experience into traditional broadcasting. And when those come together, we think that the convergence provides more relevant and engaging content for audiences, regardless of what platform they're on.
Okay, I'm going to get back to some of this in a minute. Now, obviously, you have been working on this for a while. You've been talking to people. I know every once in a while I will overhear one of Jason's conversations. I don't understand any of it, which is why we're here, trying to make sure that it becomes more understandable. So right now, why does Sinclair want this?
So I can't speak for the larger organization
No.
itself, but for me personally, for the past 4 or 5 years that I've been at Sinclair, we've been talking about ATSC 3.0, the opportunities, not just from the technical side, but especially from the business side when it comes to delivering the right content to the right audience. And so about 6 months ago, we had an internal discussion with our CTO and our deputy CTO, which is, it's time to start moving forward on this, to actually deliver this to the marketplace. And so this was very apparent at NAB, where we made public statements about what our deployment will be, 30 markets by the end of 2019. I don't know the exact number, but the objective is that we're going to deliver this. And for me personally, that kind of spearheaded when I was in Hunt Valley in December, is I finally had a chance to be in a market where there's ATSC 3.0 being transmitted.
Okay.
And as an engineer and software designer, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, this doesn't seem too hard. I can write something up that will process this. And I spent a month working on forking something else, and I realized, this isn't the right way. I want that month of my life back.
Okay.
But instead, so I used that to build an open source library called libatsc3, which provides a lot of those technical fundamentals.
Right.
At the end of the day, now I can, when I go into a market like Phoenix or Dallas when it's lit, or Hunt Valley or Santa Barbara, with the ATSC 3.0 receiver and very simple software. Additionally, Triveni makes software for this, but now I can actually see this. Now it becomes real. Now it becomes tangible. The 4 or 5 years of talking about it, now I can actually see how this starts to come together, and that's really exciting for me.
So what literally are you seeing?
So in this case, I go all the way down to, because of the relationships that we have on the One Media side, all the way down to the RF emission side,
Okay.
all the way up to being able to consume the HEVC delivery, but more importantly, the components of what would be the interactive application sets.
I knew I didn't ask this question correctly. As a viewer, what am I
Yes.
seeing?
So right now, as a viewer, the challenge comes in from the business side, is
Okay.
that traditional syndication and network affiliations don't necessarily cover in ATSC as a distribution.
Okay.
Sometimes in certain arrangements, they count as additional plays of content. So it's going to be an interesting position as over the next couple of years is how those are reflected to support 1.0 and 3.0 working together, but also how digital kind of plays in the ecosystem. So to answer your question, right now you see a lot of early, more digital first content out there. But we think probably in the next 2 to 3 years, it's fundamentally going to be much more relevant and engaging than the initial pilots of proving out the technology.
Okay, so you've talked about a combination of OTT and OTA. What does that mean for the people in this room or for the people who are delivering?
So there are a lot of great vendors on the floor and partners on the floor. And what that means is potentially the content that you're making available not just for VOD, but also for live programming. And obviously live is a huge component of how we do our business, is that same distribution of Dash, if you will, can be used. But there's also partners out there in the market that support MMT for live distribution. So the same content that you produce with very similar workflows right now for OTT, there is an opportunity to integrate effectively to solve the delivery component of this. Doesn't mean you have to rebuild your whole workflow. It means that by adding in specifically into the content delivery, the opportunity then becomes available to provide hybrid apps in the marketplace.
Okay, so if we went and we were talking earlier about multicast. So what, if I'm delivering content, why is this important to me?
So let me give you just kind of a quick anecdote is I have a friend of mine who is based in Southern California. He works for a large company that they do something called Blizzcon, right?
Okay.
It's a major esports event.
Esports.
And I didn't think it was that big of a deal until I actually went there. There's something like on the order for a weekend in LA, like 50,000 participants. And when I say participants, I don't mean attendees. I mean people who are actually there interacting, playing the games on the floor, and part of the experience. Like this is an ingrained, like immersive environment that's just absolutely amazing when you actually see it. The corollary to this is that the same people who couldn't make it there because they couldn't buy a ticket, they were moving something on the order of 3 terabits a second through Akamai for one program feed.
Okay, so you essentially have people online
All over the world.
interacting.
Yes. Yeah, consuming this content at a massive scale.
Esports, basically mega broadcast,
Yeah,
right?
but they're just watching the same program feed. Like
Okay.
they may have different language or narration behind it, but that's an artifact. The
Okay.
core video that they're moving of 1080p at 8 megabits, that's still 250,000 viewers. Like why do I need to send that copy out so many times?
Right.
So fundamentally, about 30 years ago, when the original people started building the internet, they provided a technology called multicast inside of there. But it was kind of stuck in the academia portion of how the internet worked. The ability to deliver content over multicast and receive it was really essentially the Wild West back then. There wasn't strong technology to support its routing, its network topology, all these other technical things to
For
facilitate.
anybody here who doesn't know what multicast is, can you just explain
Yeah.
it very basically?
So the idea is that what we're doing right here, this is multicast,
Okay.
right? If I'm talking to you personally, this is unicast. This is
Okay.
how traditional IP delivery works.
Right.
But when I talk out this way, this is multicast, meaning
Okay.
that from one sender, there are multiple recipients.
Right.
This has an incredible economies of scale of being able to deliver content to a mass audience. And network technology supports it, but it's very limited in scope of how it works. So one of the fundamental things that ATSC does is it works on those foundational pieces from what was learned 20 years ago and actually bring it to a business use case, which is to deliver content.
Okay, all right. Now, let's see here. I've got so many other questions, but we first talked a little bit the other day about a multicast market exchange. What is that?
So here's the interesting scenario that comes out with ATSC 3.0 is because so much of the technology that drives OTT is already cloud-based. It's already virtualized.
Okay.
Some use cases and environments, there are partners out there that distribute OTT content and video, especially live, that they don't really have a physical infrastructure except for the OTT devices that are being received for that content. So this sets a really interesting precedent about how to rethink broadcast. Broadcast doesn't necessarily mean you have to have facilities and infrastructure and operations to make all of this work like it used to be 10 or 15 years ago. The FCC changed the main studio rule. Now, that's not a huge impact onto it, but the idea of being able to do essentially automation, to do playout, to do traffic, to do advertising, to do delivery, encoding in the cloud, all those pieces that used to be on premise, the OTT ecosystem has done really well with being able to move those up there. The broadcast community is incrementally getting there. And as it gets closer and closer, the opportunity to change how those workflows impact traditional media in the ATSC 3.0 space is hugely beneficial. Now, what we've started to think about this is in conjunction with Nexstar is we've started a separate entity called Spectrum Co. Now, Spectrum Co is responsible for being able to facilitate virtual channel sharing. So that means if I'm a broadcaster, potentially I can enter into a market and say, I want 3 megabits for my content distribution.
Okay.
Through this independent consortium of broadcasters. It's not through Sinclair, it's not through one or the other, but it's a consortium to help make this successful. One of the important things that I forgot to mention at the very beginning is, whereas the transition from analog to digital was a FCC mandate.
Right.
ATSC 1.0 to 3.0 is a voluntary exercise for broadcasters.
Okay.
So that means in order to make this work successfully, we all have to kind of work together, and we have to open up the market to other participants who would potentially have incredible opportunities for value from that spectrum. So what that means is altogether is what we've been able to take from OTT, what we've been able to augment in the marketplace of being able to share spectrum and bandwidth and the broadcast distribution, is bring that into an ecosystem where we're looking to call it essentially broadcast marketplace exchange.
Okay.
So that way, I as a broadcaster, I don't need to be present in one specific market to reach only that audience. Potentially, I could reach, in the esports gaming case, maybe it's just a weekend event. I don't need a full channel 24/7, 365. I just need it for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Interesting.
This model would give them the opportunity then to distribute content, which would traditionally only be in desktop or OTT, in a much wider reach and penetration at a higher quality than a IP-connected unicast delivery. So that's the first foundational set. And we think it's going to take a couple of years for everything to move properly in there.
Okay.
But then when we look forward into things like 5G, right, this has always been the next discussion, which is, well, is it going to be ATSC 3.0 or 5G? And my perspective is I don't really care because fundamentally, going back to the 3.0 is smarter pipes. And smarter pipes give you that economies of scale from it. The bigger pipes will give you personal data and information that you want to consume. But in general, there's a corollary somewhere in here between what a market wants to consume and what an individual wants to consume. And so we can either overload 5G use cases, or we can find a right way to merge in the same sort of fundamental technology in the 5G ecosystem under 3PP. That's one of the things that the smart people on the East Coast are working on. Fundamentally, though, what that translates into is then for the next decade is what we're really talking about in the industry is building a not a broadcast marketplace exchange, but a multicast marketplace exchange, where that way the problems that facilitated from the educational side of adopting multicast and to dropping it for unicast would be solved by this, by essentially the marketplace, by being able to integrate between content creators, content distributors, traditional CDNs, and next generation wireless capabilities like ATSC 3.0 and 5G in a unified kind of network experience. I don't want to say like the Enron model 10 years ago, but the ability to take one piece of content and say, I want to deliver this across the US, and to facilitate that as a transaction.
Now, I have a bunch of different questions, but so let me just touch on a little bit. You mentioned at one point to me broadcast as a service, and this is what you mean by that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of the OTT players out here, if they haven't started thinking about it, there are a number of great use cases for live content distribution and even programmatic distribution. I don't want to go into too much detail, but OTT products like Pluto have done a really great job about aggregating and virtualizing this content, where there's probably not much physical infrastructure behind it, except for someone in AWS or Microsoft or Google Cloud. Like, the ability to program content for audiences completely virtual is the genesis of broadcasting for the most part. And when we put that all together, that means that traditional broadcasting, there's use cases to be able to support and facilitate this in an infrastructure reduced or free model. In that case, then it really becomes a service. It's no longer, I need to spend capital expense on this infrastructure. I can start moving to operational expense and treat it more as a service I subscribe to in Amazon or Microsoft or Google, where I say, I want to be a broadcaster and reach, all of Michigan or all of Washington, and check that off as like the opportunity to reach those audiences.
And that's what I was going to say to you, is that if I'm a broadcaster, why should I do this? I mean, you've already outlined a few things, but convince me.
From a purely business perspective, there's an interesting challenge that comes in for traditional broadcasters over the next decade or so, right? And it has to do with what's called retransmission. So retransmission has been a great opportunity for broadcasters to realize the value of their audiences by charging essentially MSOs or MVPDs the right to carry their over-the-air transmissions. So in the case of Seattle, where we've got like King 5 and Como News, if you watch it on Comcast or Frontier or whatever, Verizon, or those MSOs are paying back to the broadcaster a representative portion of the monthly subscribers bill to represent what the value is for that market. So now the challenge comes in when MVPDs are faced with potential subscriber changes. Even if it's 250,000 of subscribers that are lost, that's still millions of dollars that are going to start dropping. And I think that was the Q4 18 numbers of what MVPDs in general lost from my notes. But the idea is that starts becoming millions of dollars to traditional broadcasters. And that's going to have a direct impact upon their ability to sustain their business. Fundamentally, if you start losing half of your monthly income, or your gross income, because someone's no longer paying you for the right or privilege to distribute your content because they don't have as large of an audience set. Now you have a fundamental economics problem where those margins that you did have start gradually walking down, and somehow you need to fundamentally transform how your broadcast business works. And this is where the smart people on the finance side are focused on, but in spirit, we know that it's going to change. And we can either be part of the change or help innovate in the change.
So we've talked about a number of things, and I think what I'll do is open us up to questions from the audience if anyone has some, and if not, I've got one or two other questions. But does anybody here have a question? And if you say the question, I can repeat it for the recording. And we have the gentleman next to Dom.
So great question.
So the question was, what type of streaming security is defined by ATSC 3.0?
So right now in the A360 standard, there are a couple different technical discussions about what should be adopted in the standard. Personally, I think the Google's Widevine product has done a fantastic job for device security. The challenge comes in is that the ATSC 3.0 committee defines the specifications for the broadcast chain up to transmission. They do not define the specifications for the receiver. So it really comes up to the alignment in the marketplace to be able to support that. But fundamentally, I've been very impressed with how Widevine is potentially capable, meets a number of business use cases for rental and distribution. More importantly, as ATSC 3.0 starts to mature, there's another component called DRC, direct return channel. And what it allows is non-internet connected devices like a television to be able to support a back channel in that same forward ATSC 3.0 spectrum. So it opens up a lot of interesting opportunities for license acquisition of content. In comparison, there's Apple's Fair Play product. It's HLS specific. There's a lot of other challenges that come along with it. And when you look at some of the other competitors in the marketplace, like PlayReady is not really a widely supported content protection scheme. Symmetric key distribution is always going to be problematic without a trusted runtime environment and secure license acquisition workflow on the device. So in general, I think the opportunity is there to adopt an industry standard that's used in OTT for OTA with the possibility of being able to support a back channel for license acquisition for the devices.
Dom, I know you have another question, so.
Well, I love my multicasters and topics. So just a quick sort of statement and observation. Between 2001 and 2009, I ran a CDN in the UK, which was called Multicast Internet Exchange. We were all about driving multicast adoption through access networks. And it was a slog. I'm sure you're familiar with that story. One of the big commercial problems we ran into was that unicasting, the inefficiencies of unicasting actually makes certain organisations a lot of money. So there's a resistance to deploying multicast. So I think initiatives like ATSC 3, LTE broadcast, the parallel technology, I think they're really important about its movement to scaling like being extremely useful. But just two questions in the ATSC 3 context. The first one is, I'm just out of curiosity interested to know whether you're still using IGFTP3 and some of those legacy protocols, or whether there's been a round of innovation in the group management protocols, because that was a tricky issue within deployment. And the second one is more specifically within RF broadcasting of multicast. Right at the edge, you're still spectrum limited. You can't actually transmit any more channels over a full capacity mast with multicast than you can with broadcast.
Let's go for the second part of this first. And can you repeat his question just so that?
Sure. The second question was aligned with in the 6 megahertz of forward delivery spectrum that you have as a broadcaster, how can you provide more content in that same set of limited pipes? So the short answer is for that scenario and use case, you're absolutely correct. There's essentially something called the digital cliff, which is the ability for a receiver to determine between signal to noise. And that comes very closely to something else called the Shannon limit, which is an old Bell system technical analysis of how closely you can get to the signal to noise differentiation between it. Now, I'm not an RF engineer, and we do have a number of smart people who work on this and who have been working on this for decades. But there's kind of two important pieces that fundamentally differentiate between like the 1.0 distribution model, which is an 8 VSB model, and ATSC 3.0 as a COFDM model. The first well, technically there's three, but the first fundamental use case that's important to just understand in context is that with 3.0, the investment in technologies like software-defined radios has been massive to support the waveform emission, reception, and also transmission. And what we start talking about is literally on the nanosecond level of grooming that waveform emission for the transport medium. Now, that's super duper complex. I have no idea how they do this, but it's amazing in theory, because what this allows the broadcast stick to do now is to take, in the 3.0 network ecosystem, is what is a single frequency network, and be able to then drop on top of it what's called LDM, layered division multiplexing, so that way your 6 megahertz of spectrum you have for distribution is a function of spatial representation, not of signal to noise ratio for reception, because you can intermodulate on top of these two for different characteristics, and fundamentally that's in the physical layer pipe. You can define different resiliency and durability of the forward transmission, and then provide a separate emission that is tower specific to that spatially aware area. Now that's the first part of being able to groom the RF emission and capacity side for IP multicast distribution. Secondarily, the adoption of what's called, essentially, going back to the mid-'80s, which is the building blocks of layered coding transport. You have LCT, you have asynchronous layered coding, then you have FAC on top of it, then you have carousel object delivery with flute.
Okay, some of this I know you guys want to talk about over a drink.
Yeah, let me.
The thing is, I'm afraid that we might lose some people in the audience.
Yeah, so let me just wrap this up really quickly, because I appreciate you pulling that back. But the idea is that in traditional 1.0 broadcasting, you usually have, let's just say, a 12 megabit MPEG-2 video stream, right? Well, the efficacy with 3.0 is you can take that 12 megabits and probably move it down to somewhere on the order of 768 kilobits a second. Now, there's a lot going into it, because you will need to do a basin enhancement layer and split that off to short closed GOPS to be able to support channel change, but ultra long GOPS to be able to support long detection. But what I just did was I took a 12 megabit stream and said you will now have 11.2 megabits available for distribution. And that's something that we have running today with ATEM. So
what I'm going to do now is take the top stream of the presentation, which says that to keep this on a business level, so the people who are in the audience, I know they have a lot of technical questions for you, which is great, because the thing is that that's one of the reasons why Jason volunteered to do this session, is because he has a lot of people he's been working with. Now, I want to make sure that if there's any other questions in the audience that people would like to ask, just so that we get a little bit more interaction, and I promise you guys over drinks you can talk about this. Fred, what would your question be?
With the set manufacturers,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the question is, with the set manufacturers, are they going to be pre-caching? I missed half of the question. Did you catch it?
Yeah, so in Spirit, there is a huge opportunity in supporting ATSC 3.0 and the multicast model, the data delivery model, right? Traditional broadcasters, they don't think of moving video as data, as an experience. But I don't want to overspeak for consumer electronics manufacturers, but there is a massive opportunity now that companies like Samsung have produced a 1 terabyte cell-based memory chip that is going to be in cell phones. Sinclair has also made an investment in a company called Sankea Labs. They're building and fabbing out with Samsung Foundry a set of ATSC 3.0 and 5G capable software-defined radio sets. So if you take the data distribution model of a SDR and you take the opportunity of a 1 terabyte flash memory storage, and then you overlay the transmission capabilities of the route delivery for pre-positioning, now you go beyond just positioning for personalized content. You factor in the conditional access component And if you're a company that does large-scale VOD distribution, you can deliver, like hypothetically, the next Game of Thrones episode because you've got 6 days, 23 hours, and 1 second before it needs to be received again. But now everyone who can receive that would have the 4K UHD version with conditional access gating. And this pre-positioning of content, especially that's episodic or from a value-added virtual MVPD, is really, really interesting when it's gated correctly. Because now that storage doesn't just mean that I'm being personalized to, it means that I have access to, with a commerce transaction in there, content that otherwise I wouldn't easily be able to get to. Even with gigabit internet at home, I still get poor quality renditions of content from Hulu, right? And what's even more frustrating is if I watch the same episode last week and the week before of my favorite TV show, like Always Sunny in Philadelphia, right? Because it's humorous and it's a little millennial in its way, but why am I always downloading the same thing over and over again if the opportunity to cache that in a controlled environment exists? I think fundamentally that opens up, it solves the challenge of multicast when it comes to relevancy and temporal coherency, meaning that if I have a large enough cache, maybe a terabyte will last me 2 weeks this year. But maybe as more partners come into Spectrum Co., that moves into 100 megabit forward or 200 megabit forwards. And maybe that 1 terabyte just lasts me a week. But there's content in there that's probably relevant for me. And if it's not relevant for me, as a broadcaster, it really didn't cost me any incremental exchange to be able to have that available to a potential viewer of that or utilization of that data.
Now, Fred, did you just ask though whether the ads were pre-cached within the systems that they were?
Well, both content
And ads, okay.
So the intent would be they're in the ATSC 3.0 advertising ecosystem world, and we could talk about this after the fact, is with the right integration from technical standards like SCUDdy 35 and the ability to integrate with next generation traffic systems, the gradated mix of national, regional, local, zonal, pre-position, and then client-side digital ad insertion, when it's done correctly, absolutely. And with the intelligent integration between the traffic and automation system, when that order's entered in, absolutely could start being delivered out in that carousel, even if it doesn't run today or tomorrow or next week, because it's all part of the ad signaling, whether in route or whether in some net new engineering in MMT, the opportunity exists to provide relevant, contextual, engaging content for audiences in the ATSC ecosystem that just doesn't exist right now in traditional broadcasting for advertising.
Okay. Well, we're almost over time, but I'm happy to continue having some questions. Yes, gentleman over here.
Straightforward question. What's the advantages of ATSC 3.0 versus LTE?
So the
from-
question,
yep.
ATSC versus LT 3. Yes.
So the first challenge is in LTE broadcast, I believe there is a pretty substantial overhead tax for multicast distribution. The second challenge is, from my experience, it's very application-centric, meaning it only, for me personally, it's only worked on Verizon and it's only worked in the NFL mobile app. For me as a consumer, like, that's not a value proposition, right? I don't care how that works, I just want my content. And when it's marketed that way, there's a bit of a gap there where it's only a very niche set of products and capabilities. But I think fundamentally, the network design and topology, but more importantly, the flexibility and durability of ATSC 3.0 from the RF emission side provides a technical counter to just the transport and delivery. So I'm not an RF engineer, but from the high level use cases is, if I'm a content creator and distributor, my flip side of the question is, how could I even access LTE broadcast today? And I don't know what that answer is, but I guarantee you that that's part of what Spectrum Co. is making available into 3.0.
Okay. Anybody else, or shall we send you on your way? We have one more gentleman here, and you're all being very great, because you know that there's drinks in about 20 minutes in the other room. Yes, sir.
I'll be real quick then.
That's okay.
All right, no, it was really a business question.
Sure. No, we're happy to take your questions.
5G.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, ultimately, we ran into nobody enabling FM receivers on these things. Maybe don't want to discuss, but we all know. So why wouldn't the same happen?
So the question is, will ATSC be supported in hardware?
So,
Not just support it,
yeah.
hardware will be turned on.
Will it be supported and turned on?
FM receivers that never turn on.
So our objective absolutely is to facilitate that because, like I stated before, we view them not as competing technologies. We view them as overlapping, where it is a software-defined radio chipset that can operate in either a ATSC 3.0 mode, a 5G mode, a 4G LTE mode, because it's SDR and there's multiple tuners and capability to support that on the fab level. Now, from the business application side, we think fundamentally, whether it's 3.0 all the way through, or whether it's the core components of IP multicast distribution and leveraging MMT for live linear distribution in those use cases, ATSC 3.0 is the conduit to fulfill that in an ecosystem. But if the core components of MMT distribution are brought into the 3GP protocol spec for delivering live video over 5G, then this is a home run for anyone who does broadcast content. The same thing with prepositioned object delivery for route. And then it's just a matter of back channel delivery. But I think fundamentally, over the next 3 to 5 years, the rollout and capacity deployments and requirements for a functional 5G network, besides the challenges of millimeter wavelength distribution and reception for line of sight and positioning, the network backhaul and infrastructure that's required for it will need some degree of multicast intelligence through the network, whether it's SDVN, whether it's some other capability across in the 3GP spec. But we are starting to see those components come in the ecosystem. But fundamentally is, if MMT is implemented properly in 3.0 and 5G, then they become irrelevant to the content creators and distributors. The transmission medium is just the facilitator. At the end of the day, the content should be the differentiator for audiences.
And that's, in fact, we're going to end it on the content, just because we mentioned this earlier. You said, in terms of being able to get more people picking up on the content delivery side of these things, what needs to happen?
Well, some of the things I can't really discuss in public, but there are the opportunities out there for capable content delivery networks to be able to overlay and integrate effectively with ATSC 3.0 to offload and to even preemptively or programmatically move traffic to specific markets. A great use case that we come into all the time is Facebook Live.
Okay.
Right? Because we're in 89 markets and we have common digital publishing tools for our journalists, they can take any contribution feed in our network and publish it to Facebook Live almost instantly. Now, what happens is, in a case like Seattle, that means within about 30 seconds, you go from 1 to 2 to 5 to 1,000 people. Right? So if I run a wireless network or I run an infrastructure-based network and I just threw a couple gigabits of traffic at you that's flash traffic, but it's all the same traffic, why should I pay more to distribute that in that market? This is where the multicast, multicast market exchange capability is very interesting, because if I run a CDN that has an edge node and I can deliver, an IX next to, a local ISP or a wireless carrier, then I should just deliver you the multicast rendition of it, because I know that this is going to be an overlay of some other flash traffic in the network. So I think there's an interesting point of telemetry and convergence in the CDN ecosystem, and use cases of computing at the edge are those signals and artifacts that will give you insight into the traction and uptake in an arbitrage model to be able to determine, should I send it over a unicast or a multicast model?
Okay.
And when these pieces come together, it's really going to be the next generation of Wall Street traders that move off the desk and move into moving bits and bytes.
Okay. All right. We're going to end it there. And thank you all for sticking around. And I'm very impressed that you guys have had quite a bit of questions. Jason will be around for a little bit for anybody who has the deeper discussions that they want to have that we didn't answer here. And anyone who has the other interesting questions who don't get a chance to follow up, feel free to contact me and I will forward them to Jason.
Great.
Thank you.